good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion you've just had, both on what you thought of the morning, but also, of course, then onto our second topic, perhaps a rather more disparate topic than was this morning. We've got a whole series of issues of regulation, ranging from weed killer through to genetically modified foods, and we'll try and talk a little bit about each of those, as well as the rather broader issue of what should be, if any, the form of subsidy and the regulations of subsidy for farming, and how do we maintain security of supply and all the rest of it. Anyway, as was the case this morning, we have three expert speakers. Again, as this morning, each of them coming from a somewhat different perspective. But let me introduce the three of them to you. First of all is Charlotte Burns. Charlotte is Professor of Politics at the University of Sheffield, and she's got a particular interest in environmental issues and EU environmental policy. And she's co-chair of an academic research group that's studying the environmental implications of Brexit, both across the UK, including the devolved parts of the UK, and also for the European Union. Rob Percival is head of policy at the Soil Association, and that campaigns for healthy, humane and sustainable food, farming and land use. And the Soil Association also runs a company that certifies the organic status of food and other products. And then Nick van Westenholz is the director of EU Exit and International Trade at the National Farmers Union, which is the largest representative body of farmers and growers in England and Wales, and lobbying government on their behalf. And as well as doing the day job, he's also an arable farmer himself. So Charlotte, Rob and Nick, as you will be aware, we've got a whole set of questions that our participants have come up with during the course of an hour's discussion before now. But we thought we might, before we get into some of the specific issues, there are one or two general questions that perhaps we should address, and it's essentially to do with how much this country both grows its own food and should be growing its own food. So just to throw two or three of these points at you. So Monique is our group is asking, how much food do we export as opposed to how much we import? And how much do we import from the EU as opposed to other non-EU countries? And then, linked to that is, well, why do we both import and export food? And the issue of why do we import lamb from New Zealand but export Welsh lamb to the European Union? And, could we just not simply be more self-sufficient? And equally, how much of our food do we produce? Are we self-sufficient, or are we not self-sufficient, and how far short are we? So I think some general back questions here about how much of our food we produce and how much we import, and insofar as we do, where does it come from? Charlotte, can I throw some of those questions initially at you?
Yeah, I suspect that Nick will be better on the stats as to how much we import and export. Certainly the EU is one of our major export markets. I think it's a really interesting question about why do we import and export food, and reflecting on the food that we eat and how that's changed over time. So a lot of the food that we eat now that we're importing is stuff that even when I was a kid, you wouldn't see out of season. So it's also, about importing. I really like mangoes and coriander, but in the 1970s in Manchester, you didn't really get mangoes and coriander. So it's about the expectations of what we grow. I think we probably could be more self-sufficient than we are now, but consumers have got used to a certain type and range of food being available, which does require us to import. So it strikes me there's some choices there about what kind of foods we want to be eating. If we want to go back to just eating seasonal food and quite a narrow range of food, then we could move much more towards just relying upon food that's grown within the UK. But if we want to carry on having a range of different types of food, then we will need to be importing from other parts of the world. And then in terms of why we import and export, well, it's about markets. So it's about, can we buy food more cheaply from other parts of the world? Can we sell at a greater profit if we export to other parts of the world? So those would be my initial responses, but I'm hoping Nick's going to be able to come in with lots of statistics. I just dropped you in it, Nick, sorry.
I'll try. I'll sort of rack my brain and delve into it and see what I can come out with. But I think in terms of the breakdown of imports and exports, in terms of what we eat, about half of the food we consume in the UK is produced here. That's not quite the same as self-sufficiency ratio, which is how much of the food we consume compared to the amount of food we produce, because we do export some food. So we could actually provide about 60% of the food we eat, but given we export about 20% of the food we produce, the actual percentage is about 50%. We then import about, so of the other 50%, 30% is imported from the EU and 20% is imported from outside the EU. Those are the very rough figures. And yeah, I would, as a UK farmer and representing UK farmers, we would like to produce more of the food we eat. Of course we would. I think historically it's quite low. It's not historically low as a percentage of the food we eat, how much we produce here, but it was the highest it was in recent history, i.e. the last century or so, was in the early 80s, I think, where that figure was up near over 80%, the self-sufficiency ratio. So it certainly could be a lot higher. Having said that, I don't think anybody sensible would suggest it should be 100%, because actually just to have a resilient food supply system, you need a little bit of diversity there. We do have bad harvests here. We've just had a very bad harvest indeed. So you need to be able to supply or to source food from different places. So imports do have a role to play. The other point is around what we call carcass balance. This is particularly relevant for livestock production, where I'll give you an example. The preference amongst UK consumers is for the white meat of chicken, not really the brown meat. So actually, and obviously when you are a poultry farmer, you produce a whole chicken which has white meat and brown meat. So actually we don't produce a sufficient amount of chicken to meet the demand for white meat, but we produce too much brown meat because there isn't much demand for it. So we actually end up needing to export that. And I think this is the point. If you rely on more production to meet demand of one thing, it just might end up you've got a surplus with others. So trade does have an important role to play as well in balancing supply and demand, which you can't necessarily do when you have a very small domestic market.
Okay. I'm tempted to ask who eats the brown meat from chicken, but I think we'll move on. Rob.
Yeah, I think I'd add to that that as well as looking at supply and demand, we need to look at options for diets and land use. So we're roughly 12%, I think, 10-15% self-sufficient in veg, and we know that we don't eat enough. So there seems like there's an obvious imperative there to produce more here and to eat more of it. And when we're looking at UK land use, there are some trade-offs that can be considered. So roughly 50% of UK arable land is used to produce feed crops for animal farming. So for lots of the chickens and the pigs that we eat. So when we, in addition to looking at trade, we need to be looking at how we're using our land and what the optimal use of that land is for our own health and for the nature outcomes that we need to see as well. So if you look at UK diets and the trajectory they need to go on, and align UK land use in roughly the same direction, then that will have some knock-on implications for the trade balance.
Okay, all right, that's very helpful to get us started on this. Charlie, was there something you wanted to say before we moved on?
No, I was just saying I like brown meat off chicken. My
I see.
I'm
You
a
answered my
vegetarian, and
question.
two people who
Answering
don't.
my
But
question
I
to
like
Nick. Right. Okay. Fine. All right. Now we've got a number of specific issues to cover, so let's see if we can work through each of them. So, one of the issues is whether or not now we're outside the European Union or almost outside the European Union. Should we change the regulations of genetically modified food? And a number of groups have raised questions about this. And let me pick 2 or 3 of them out. So I think the broadest question comes from Marie's group, and it's essentially, what is the evidence about the safety and nutritional benefits of different types of GM foods? There's a particular question from Nicola's group about, do they have any impact on pollinators? And again, another wider question from Katie's group: how much, I mean, in what ways and how much might GMOs affect our ecosystem? So I think there's a general theme here, which is, well, what do we know about what we think the impact of allowing the growth of GM foods might actually have? So Nick, can I start you with that, and then I'll hand it to Rob.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult issue, this, because it is so emotive, and lots of the arguments on both sides of it are very passionately held. It's worth saying, as the NFU, we believe that there should be a kind of evidence-based, science-based approach to it, and our sense is at the moment the approach is too precautionary, and actually there could be some benefits of these sorts of products, and it's not necessarily just GMO. Actually, there are newer technologies sort of coming in which are interesting, potentially safer, not necessary, but potentially safer. But the issue is, what are you trying to do here? You may be, for example, trying to reduce your use of pesticides, or reduce the amount of water you need to grow things. So good things, sustainable things. But of course, there may be impacts of that. They may have environmental impacts. So you need to get a balance. But at the moment, it seems to us that the balance is too far one way. So we're not getting a chance to see whether those benefits can be maintained. Now, there is evidence.
Nick, are there any particular GM foods that the NFU have already identified as ones that they think perhaps we should be trying to grow inside the UK?
I wouldn't alight on anything in particular, because actually it's so far down the line, the European process, that, actually, were there to be anything green light at the moment, it would still take quite a long time for it to come on track. And actually our focus at the moment is having a regulatory system that might incentivize the process of beginning to get some of those on market. But it's worth mentioning, actually, that even if this all changed now, it would be some years before you saw anything being cultivated, probably in the UK. The thing I would say quickly is, in other parts of the world, GMO crops have been grown for a long time. Now, there are those who will say these have been grown with problems, but generally, certainly when it comes to human health, there don't seem to have been any issues from the use of GM crops. And the important thing here, and we'll probably come back to this with the question about pesticides, weed killers later, is actually having a robust regulatory system that does its job. So for us, the point is, if something is harmful, then you need to either ban it because you can't control that harm, or find a way of regulating it so the use minimizes the harm, because usually there's a plus side to that thing. It might be, for example, in these sorts of crops, things I mentioned around reducing pesticide use and water, etc. So, there's a balance to be struck between the advantages, the benefits of using something, and the harm that it might cause. And a good regulatory system should manage those. But at the moment, that doesn't seem to us to be working very well. Okay,
no. So Rob, where does the Soil Association stand on this question? And I think perhaps one thing maybe you could help us on, because this was certainly true of one of the discussions I was listening to earlier, is what, if any, is the difference between what we mean by GM food and, for example, the fact that I can buy seedless grapes in my supermarket or grow hybrid roses in my garden?
Well, genes of most plants have been deliberately altered through conventional breeding methods, but GM organisms go through a different process wherein DNA is artificially added or removed or changed in the lab, and new genetic engineering techniques as well employ what is essentially a different process, and the complexity and implications of that process are hotly debated, and the consequences, and as Nick alluded to, that it can be a very divisive and emotive subject. I think the two key points I'd make is that talking of a ban isn't necessarily the right framing. It's as Nick said, about having the right regulatory framework in place. And we are supportive of the Soil Association of the precautionary approach that's being taken across the EU, where we feel it's appropriate that GM technologies, the full implications of them are assessed before those products are allowed into our food and farming system. But the bigger point I'd make, I think, is that I think we have to start with a vision of what we want our farming and food system to be, and then look at the role of technologies within that, instead of getting too fixated on individual technologies and pursuing them for their own sake. There's been a lot of hype about GM in the past 20 years, but it's often seemed like a technology in search of a problem. We know how to farm without pesticides or with reduced levels of pesticides. We know how to build resilience into our farming systems, and it's being demonstrated in various countries that you can build your food security, you can respond to the climate crisis, you can help restore the natural world without needing to rely on these technologies. So I think the priority in the near future for the British farming system is to pursue those avenues that we know work, the approaches, the shift away from high levels of chemical inputs to more nature-friendly farming methods, while simultaneously maintaining productivity and making sure that we're producing the right foods, healthy foods. And then, you know, the conversation around genetic technologies are going to go on for the next few years. It's not going to be resolved in this Brexit moment.
Yeah, I mean, does that perspective on how we should farm, I mean, is that particular to a country that has the good fortune to, you know, be quite green and have a climate that does support growth? I mean, a lot of the use of GM seems to have been, for example, in parts of less well-developed countries where either there are issues about the adequacy of people's diets, or the ensuring that you can actually deal with might be more serious problems of pesticide or of drought or flood. So I mean, is this perspective one that's particular to a relatively favoured country, and is it one that would necessarily apply to using GM food elsewhere?
I mean, I'd say no. I mean, I'm not making a blanket statement that the GM foods or GM techniques should have no place at all. But I do think it's the case that regardless of your local environmental conditions, there are what we call agroecological solutions. So they don't look the same in every place, but the type of farming approaches that build natural capital, that nurture soil health, that build resilience, and that produce healthy foods can be employed everywhere. And while each country has its own specific challenges, and as you allude to, in developing countries there are challenges which are very different to those we face in the UK, I haven't seen any evidence, and I don't believe it is the case, that GM foods are the only answer in any of those contexts. I think there are alternatives, and so in each case you need to be weighing up the pros and cons, and ultimately, as I said, looking at the big picture. What kind of food and farming system do we want and do we need in the context of the crises that we're facing? Okay,
so Charlie, what is it that people worry about here? What are the pros and cons that are central to this debate, insofar as we know them?
I mean, I think one of the things that hasn't been touched on, a lot of the disquiet, I think, comes from how and why GM foods are being developed and who benefits from them, and whether or not there are particular corporations that are benefiting from them. So Nick alluded to reducing the use of pesticides, but one of the challenges that we've seen in countries that have used GM crops is when you get cross-fertilization or cross-contamination from GM crops to non-GM crops, and then you have to buy a pesticide, especially from the company that's originally developed the GM crop, in order to deal with the new crops that are then emerging. So there's some cynicism, I think, about the motivations of companies who, certainly in the initial stages of developing these crops, didn't do themselves a huge amount of favours in the way that they went about trying to promote crops, particularly, for example, in countries that farmers, for example, might want to reuse their seeds, and there was moves to introduce suicide seeds so that seeds could be used year after year. So I think a lot of the disquiet is about what's the motivation of companies. I think the point at which we started discussing GMOs was when we were in the middle of a massive food crisis in the EU and in the UK. So there was a lot of skepticism again about, yeah, is this food safe? Why should we be accepting it onto our markets? And I think that's why we've ended up with this very precautionary system. The evidence seems to be that, yes, GM foods that are available on the market are safe, otherwise they wouldn't be on the market. The question around pollinators, I'm not aware of any evidence specifically on damaging pollinators, but again, there is that question, particularly if you're thinking about organic farms and how close they are to GM crops being grown, about pollination, cross-pollination from one species to another. So, you know, there are some issues there that I think gave rise to legitimate concerns.
One follow-up question, one of the groups asked specifically, Charlie, was have there ever been any GM disasters anywhere in the world? That came from Claire's group.
I'm wondering what a GM disaster would be. It's sort of put me in mind of triffids a little bit. I've sort of got visions of giant celery. So there have been cases, I think, of cross-contamination, but nothing that I would necessarily say I would classify as a disaster. So nothing like the equivalent of BSE. But I think that's partly because the EU and the UK put in place very precautionary regimes because of public concern about what these foodstuffs were and how and why they were being introduced into the marketplace. I don't know if Nick or Rob has got any insight into you know, massive GM crisis.
Have you got, Nick or Rob, anything you want to add to this before we move on to another subject?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not aware of any sort of GM disasters, but as you say, there have been probably better termed as incidents over the years with cross-contamination. But I just wanted to make one point, actually, to the point both Rob and I made about this being very emotive. And I agree with Charlie's point about large corporations. I mean, often the developers of these technologies, GM crops and like, will be very big corporations. They'll have big commercial interests in that, and that is true. It's also because it's a very expensive business doing this, but rightly or wrongly. But it's also worth reflecting that it kind of goes the other way as well. And I think what we have seen is a lot of the resistance to GM crops. I mean, there's good arguments against it, which have been sort of flagged here, but some of this, I think, is also an anti-corporate agenda we should be aware of as well. That it's not necessarily about the argument specifically about GM. It's a sort of proxy for wider problems people have with the role of big corporates in the agri-food chain. And so again, it clouds the water and the arguments around this in quite an unhelpful way. And I think, you know, those issues apply to both sides of the argument. Okay,
Rob, do you want to add anything at this point, or?
No, it's fine.
Okay, right. In which case, let's move on to another subject that is also hotly debated, which is the live export of animals. So there's a number of groups that raise some questions here. So let me see if we can package 2 or 3 of them together. So Claire's group, for example, has asked, what are the benefits of live exports and what type of controls can we put on it? And I think following on from the second half of their question, Angela's group is saying, well, what does the World Trade Organization say about live export of animals, and would it get upset if we were to introduce such a ban? And then equally, Katie is saying, well, Katie's group, well, but if we do ban them, what do we do about the export between Northern Ireland and Great Britain? So, Rob, would you like to lead us off on that one?
Sure. So I'm not close to the World Trade Organization stance on this, but
okay, fine.
But I'll happily speak to the pros and cons, and
Sure.
the case for being very much around the UK willingness in some instances to eat the product. So we don't like to eat in this country roast veal or calves from the dairy system. So there's a bit of a conversation to be had if the UK wants to take a stance against live export on the grounds of animal welfare about what we're willing to eat, and there's a good case for a shift in the national diet there. If we're going to drink dairy, then we have to understand the consequences.
Can I just for the purpose of clarification, are you saying that if we want to ban the live export of animals, we might have to be willing to eat veal?
I'm saying that, yeah, again, banning is a blunt instrument, and there's a bigger picture here.
Okay.
So we should be eating veal if we're drinking dairy, and associated with that as well, the big picture stuff. We need to be looking at the infrastructure we have in this country around animal slaughter, and there's been a trend recently towards the closure of small slaughterhouses, animals having to travel larger distances within the country. The UK public has made clear in the context of Brexit, and particularly in the context of US trade negotiations, that animal welfare is a high priority. So there is, I think, a strong case on animal welfare grounds to prohibit the live export of animals. But if we're going to go down that route, then we also need to be talking about what we're eating and how the infrastructure that we have within this country to handle our farm animals.
Okay, Charlie.
So on the WTO point, I mean, on this, the WTO's concern would just be around most favoured nation status, so that if we're going to ban live export of animals, we would need to be able to justify it under the rules. So we would need to be able to.
What do you mean by most favoured nation status?
So if you have to treat, basically you have to treat states that you trade with in the same way. So if you treat one state in a particular way, all the other states that you trade with, you have to treat in the same way. So we couldn't suddenly ban something without the World Trade Organization getting involved. We could, under international agreements, use ethical grounds to say we're banning this because we think it's bad for animals, but whether or not we'd win that case remains to be seen. So it's likely that there would be legal action that would be taken. I mean, one of the points that it's worth making is when we talk about live exports, we need to bear in mind how far the animals are going to travel. So we could have internal movement of animals that could be, you know, from Scotland down to the southwest, that could take longer than it takes to get from Dover to France. So it's partly about the fact that you're exporting animals, but it should also be about the length of the journey. So this conversation shouldn't just be about exporting, it should also be about how long do we think animals should be in transit for, what kinds of conditions should they be in, what are the rules, and how do we make sure that they're properly enforced. And on the export of Northern Ireland and GB, I mean, I think if we did go down that route, that would clearly have massive implications for the export of animals, between Northern Ireland and Ireland, which I assume that there would be some kind of side agreement there, because again, you're not necessarily talking about very long journeys. So part of me thinks that the debate is being framed slightly inappropriately, and it should be about the length of journeys that are being made rather than necessarily focusing on export, would be my view.
But if we tried to ban live exports in general, but still allow them to the Republic of Ireland, are we potentially in WTO trouble?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, that would get into tricky areas.
Okay, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I've not got a lot to add to what's already been said. I'd agree with a lot of it. And I think Charlie in particular is right. This isn't really an issue about exports. And I think the problem is this debate does get framed as banning live animal exports or not. The issue is about transport of live animals and having appropriate safeguards so that those journeys are not too long. And that the conditions of the transport of the animals is reasonable.
Presumably the reason why people focus on exports is that they're not only concerned about the transport, but maybe they're concerned about what they think of the standards in slaughterhouses outside the UK.
Yeah, I guess there's potentially an issue there, but there are certainly WTO issues with that. Once the trade is happening, I think for the reasons Charlie has said, i.e. it's quite difficult to start what would be seen as meddling in other people's production methods and things which relate to their own regulatory systems, and the WTO, more correctly actually, other countries involved with the WTO tend to take a sort of dim view of people using trade barriers as a way of in sort of meddling with domestic regulation. So that might be, I can see that that's a point. I mean, actually, there is not a massive amount of live animal export trade out of the UK. There is quite a lot of transit over the Irish border, and we said that would pose a specific issue because there is an important trade and just movement of animals back and forth sometimes over the Irish border that would suddenly qualify as exports and imports, in certain future scenarios, depending on the deal or no deal that we've got coming. But actually, there's not a massive amount of live animal exports, and I do think what we should be focusing on is the general issue around animal welfare and transport.
Okay, all right. Well, as we're on the subject of animals, let's carry on in that vein and come to the questions of hormone-treated beef and chlorinated chicken. I'm going to start on chlorinated chicken because a number of groups have focused on this in particular. So why does the United States chlorinate chicken, and what does the process do? So there's a request here for somebody who can describe for us the process. This comes from Harriet's group, and then equally Josh's group. What does the research show about the public health implications of using chlorinated chicken in the US? Charlie, can you start us on that one?
Yeah, so the use of chlorine treatments or pathogen reduction treatments tends to be used in the US as a way of cleaning birds off at sort of the point at which they've been slaughtered. And the argument...
Before we get to Charlie, without being too graphic, maybe you could just describe for us what the chlorinated cleaning of chicken involves.
You know what? I've never been in a chicken factory in America, so I don't know. It might be that Nick can better answer this question. But what I was going to go on to say is part of the dispute between the EU and the US here is about how animals are treated in the production process. And the argument would be that in the US context, animals need a lot more cleaning at the point at which they're being slaughtered because they don't have such high welfare standards and because they don't have the same farm to fork approach to how you deal with animals through the product chain. But Nick, can you describe the cleaning of chickens? I feel like now I need to go and visit a chicken farm.
I mean, for what I understand, and I haven't myself been to an American poultry producer, but from what I understand, this is not a particularly complicated process. Essentially, at the end of the rearing and after the bird has been slaughtered, the carcass is washed in a pathogen reduction treatment. And in fact, these days it's unlikely to be chlorine. There are other substances, chemicals used which do the same thing. And in terms of the safety to humans of that process, there is a big question mark over that. And in fact, the US argues, to be fair, with some justification that it doesn't pose a risk to human health, although there are equally some who have said that evidence shows that the process of washing the carcass hides pathogens, so you can't detect them, but they're still there. So there is a dispute, but to be fair, there is a good, there is an argument that actually there's not a safety issue behind that. But as Charlie says, that the issue is in fact one of the way you rear the birds and the welfare of the birds and the hygiene of the bird rearing. So the US system can basically have, if they wanted, relatively poor hygiene during the rearing of the bird, because they have the safety net of washing the carcass at the end of it. In the EU and the UK, we don't have that, so you have to take much more care during the rearing of the bird. And if I could just add one more thing, the reason why this is really relevant here is because under the WTO, essentially, the ban that is in place has to be on the grounds of food safety. You're not really, there are some arguments around this as well, but it's very difficult to ban a product because you have a problem with the way it was produced. So those welfare arguments we're just talking about aren't really arguments you can raise in the WTO to ban a product. The only arguments you can use are really around food safety. So that's why this is a really complicated issue, because you have to have the argument on the basis of food safety, and there is a question mark over that. If you start having the argument on the basis of welfare and production methods under strict WTO laws, you probably lose the argument straight away. That doesn't mean it's not a very important argument. And in fact, for us, the reason why we continue to be concerned about these sorts of practices being allowed. So this is why it's a really complicated issue in terms of trade policy.
Okay, Rob?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that there's a correlated issue, which is very much linked to the welfare challenge around antibiotic use on US farms. Your average chicken in the US receives somewhere 5 to 6 times the volume of antibiotics in the UK, and there's still widespread prophylactic preventative use. And we know that this is directly contributing to antimicrobial resistance, which is going to make COVID look like small fry if we don't do something about it. So there are moves within the EU to imminently ban the preventative use of antibiotics, and we hope that the UK would follow suit. That's a whole different conversation, but that would again provide us a slightly different grounds for the trade conversation with the US. If there were clear legal restrictions on antibiotic use here which weren't mirrored there, then again we could look beyond food safety and beyond welfare to all the other issues that are effects come into play in this issue.
Okay, I think you probably neatly moved us on to the other half of this topic, which is hormone treated beef. So question here from Victoria's group is, well, what's the grounds as to why the EU has banned hormone treated beef? And again, Helen's group has asked about this and also about some of the other subjects. And what have there been any long-term studies done on the long-term impact of things like hormone treated beef or chlorinated chicken? But I think particular, we've talked about the debate about chlorinated chicken. What's the debate about hormone treated beef? So Rob, as you were in that area, would you like just to lead off on that, and then I'll come back to the O2?
So the
is there anything more to be said about that beyond the
yeah,
making at the end?
One of the reasons that hormone treatment of cattle isn't permitted in the EU as it is in the US is that one of the hormones used in the US is a known carcinogen, and the EU has taken steps in response on the basis that it could pose a threat to human health, and it concluded that there's inadequate evidence to conclude that the other 5 or 6 hormones used in the US don't pose a threat to human health. So there is a clear rationale there for concern around public health in relation to these products. Similarly, when the hormones are given to the cattle, it's as a implant, often under the skin, and associated with that is antibiotic use. And again, this is part of the reason that cattle in the US have a higher per capita antibiotic use than in the UK. And there are associated welfare concerns again around the concentrated feeding operations that these cattle are often reared in. So a similar array of concerns as relates to chicken.
Okay, Nick, do you want to add anything to this?
Not a great deal. I agree with much what Rob said. I think, again, sort of in the interest of balance, this is a classic example of WTO type disputes, because the US has argued that it's safe. Rob points out the EU argues with some justification that there are health concerns, but the US argument would be that actually, in the way that it's used and the end product eaten by the consumer, the risk is minimal. And actually, this was an issue that went to WTO dispute and actually was found in favour of the US, that actually the EU ban was not justified by the science. And that's basically because the EU takes a more precautionary approach to these things than the US. And so it's actually it's a very good example of the very difficult position that the UK now finds itself in, whether it sort of remains within the EU regulatory orbit of a more kind of precautionary approach, or whether it moves over to the US orbit, where it would have to take a more risk-based approach to these things and accept these sorts of approaches to producing food.
Okay. Charlie, anything you want to add on beef in particular?
I mean, I think it would just maybe be to reiterate the point that Rob made. A lot of what this is about the choices you want to make about food production, how you want to treat animals, how, you know, what economies of scale you want to be operating at, and what practices you're prepared to justify in order to make your beef grow really quickly, or to put lots of hens together and maximize your profit. And the challenge that, you know, as Nick just said, the challenge that the UK now faces is how much freedom will it have to make those choices for its farming system. That will depend on the trade deals that it reaches and with whom.
Okay, let me move on then to another of our subjects. This is about glyphosate. We've got 2 or 3 questions here, all really kind of digging into the same area. So Mehl's group has said, well, what are the implications of glyphosate on the environment and animals and human health? Angela's group says, you know, why hasn't it been banned by the EU already? And Andy's group says, is there a safe alternative? So basically, what's the argument about this weed killer? I mean, Charlie, would you like to kind of kick us off on that one?
Yeah, so the position in the EU at the moment is that they reviewed the use of glyphosate last year, I think, and the European Chemicals Agency found that it was safe to use, but there are, within the rules, you are still allowed to ban its use within your territory. So several countries have banned the use of some glyphosate-based products. So France and Italy, I think, have done so.
And what's the argument behind doing that?
And the argument behind doing that is there seems to be some evidence to suggest that the use of glyphosate is associated with the presence or the increased incidence of particular kinds of cancers. I think non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is one of the ones that's been mentioned in studies. But clearly, if you've got the European Chemicals Agency saying it's safe to use, that evidence isn't particularly robust. And again, this is, or not, it's not particularly robust, it's contested. And again, this is one of those areas where you've got very contentious issues being debated and evidence being mobilized by both sides of the debate, which makes it difficult as an outsider or a non-chemist to work out exactly who's right or wrong. But clearly, when you're talking about carcinogens, people are very concerned about that. And I think that's why France and Italy have acted in the way that they have. And there has been a case in the US of money being paid out to a grounds person who used this and then developed cancer. But again, I think the argument that was put forward by the company was that actually he was using it inappropriately and was using too much. So it's another tricky one where you've got 2 sides of a very heated debate going on and different interpretations of what's an acceptable level of risk and where should the precautionary principle be drawn. What's the line?
Rob.
Yeah, I'd add to that you know, a ban can be a blunt instrument if just implemented in isolation. So if we're talking about a ban on glyphosate, it would perhaps be more appropriate to talk about a progressive phase out with investment in alternatives, investment in farmer-led innovation. A tiny fraction of the government's investment in innovation goes to farmers. It's all going to, you know, technology companies and so on. So there's more on the ground research and development and knowledge sharing that can be done to support farmers to manage without glyphosate. And similarly,
what are the alternatives, Rob? What are the I mean, you know, it's, to be honest, it's not just farmers here, it's gardeners with bindweed who also use it quite a lot. So what's the alternative if we're going to try to avoid using it?
Well, I mean, some of them are being demonstrated in organic systems. So we know that it's not permitted in organic. So crop rotations, mix of autumn, spring sown crops, grass breaks, deep cultivations, mechanical harrows and higher seed rates, more competitive crops. There's lots of individual practices that can all add up to support farmers to manage without glyphosate, but we need investment in supporting a kind of transition pathway for UK farming, which doesn't just fixate on one chemical, but looks at all the inputs we're using and looks at the ecological alternatives and supports farmers to make that transition. But there is, just my final point, there is a case, I think, for banning particular uses of glyphosate, so pre-harvest use where it's sprayed just before a crop is harvested, which is responsible for a large proportion of the glyphosate that ends up in our urine and breast milk and so on. So again, it's the big picture that matters. What kind of farming system do we want, and are we willing to invest in what our farmers need to get there?
Okay, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit, and I mentioned it earlier on, because this is a bit like the GM debate, i.e. it does get very emotive, and there's sort of a bit of smoke and mirrors, if I'm honest. I think why a lot of conventional farmers get a bit exasperated about this is because actually there has been a lot of regulatory studies on glyphosate, which have by and large found it to be safe. So the one Charlie mentioned, but actually lots of national regulators have looked at it and found it to be safe. And in honesty, there's a lot of pesticides and chemicals farmers use, which are probably, you know, riskier, you know, potentially more harmful if they get used, you know, in the wrong way than glyphosate. You know, it is actually, you know, not considered to be particularly risky. But one of the reasons actually it gets caught into this is because it was originally manufactured by a major corporation, and I think, you know, that has played into these arguments, but you know, that's maybe for another day. What I would say about this, and I think Rob made some very good points about, you know, looking at alternatives, investing in alternatives, which is important, and you know, farmers would like not to be spending money on inputs if they can. So cost-effective ways of dealing with pests and diseases, whatever those are, would be welcome. But it's the point I made earlier about having a balance between the benefit of doing something and minimizing the risk of doing that thing. And any pesticide, indeed any substance, carries a risk, and you need to use of it, and you need to minimize that. But one of the arguments farmers will make about the use of glyphosate is it's an incredibly, as you touched on, John, incredibly effective weed killer. In fact, very broad use. And if you're not using that, and if you haven't develop the sorts of alternatives that Rob touched on yet, or if they're just not proving as effective as you'd like, you have to do more of those sorts of things. And that can include things like mechanical tillage, ploughing, for example, which themselves have impacts you might not necessarily want. So those release carbon into the atmosphere. They require heavy machinery to be pulled by tractors, burning diesel. So there are implications of this. And I think, you know, we just need to be careful thinking these are, you know, it's a simple solution just with an upside. It's not. Everything has a reaction. So getting rid of glyphosate purely on a precautionary measure and thinking, well, let's do it because it's safe, could actually have some implications that you wanted to avoid. So we shouldn't do it unless it's definitely, you know, unless it, well, definitely, but unless it's the right thing to do.
Okay, I'd like to use the last 10 minutes or so that we have focusing on the subject of farm payments, which obviously is arguably a particularly important subject and a particular interest to the NFU. We've got a couple of groups who've really just asked the big, broad question. Francis's group, for example, has asked, you know, what would be the impact if the subsidies provided currently under the CAP were not replaced? Equally, could you explain with some details as to why the government either should or should not keep on paying the farmers? So I think, you know, both these questions are asking about the principle of paying farmers to produce. Nick.
Yeah, I mean, just on that sort of what's the principle? I mean, it's a very convoluted and has lots of historical aspects to it question. But sort of taking a view on where we are now, most farmers around the world, not all, but most, are subsidized by their government. So actually, the kind of competitive environment for producing and selling food is one where farmers receive payments. So if you remove that, as one or two countries have historically, you can create some big issues for farmers who will just struggle to compete. Now, the main justification that over the years has just been one really around food security and governments being unwilling to run the risk of not being able to produce a degree of their own food. Where you've got to now with that argument is actually one where it's sort of a system that's become embedded into our much broader food systems. And so actually the fact that, say, for example, in the UK, food is historically cheap, it might not always feel that way for people who struggle to afford food, but actually food is historically cheap as a proportion of incomes. And, you know, you can go down to the supermarkets and see how cheap the sort of basics and staples are. That, you know, this is part and parcel. Support systems, subsidy systems are part and parcel of that cheap food system. Now, there's a massive debate, I suspect we won't go into now, about whether that is sensible, whether actually we should be paying more for our food or valuing it more. And I certainly think we ought to, because it may be incentivizing an unsustainable model of production. But at the moment, that's where we are. And just to the first question quickly, what it means is that if you remove those subsidies overnight in the UK, it estimated around about 50% of farmers in the UK would not be profitable. So it is that important to farming. You know, the idea that this is just sort of pocketed and paying for, you know, Land Rovers, as some people like to stereotype, isn't true. It really is pretty fundamental to many farmers. But of course, there are some wide variations between recipients within that. It is quite a blunt tool the way it's operated at the moment.
Rob?
Yeah, I'd agree with everything that Nick said. I think when you know, we're rightly proud of the farming standards we have in this country. But when you look at the challenges we face, there's a lot that needs to change. So we know that we can't resolve the climate crisis unless we use our land differently. Our rivers are polluted, our population is unhealthy, we're not producing enough healthy foods here, and we're producing arguably some of the wrong foods, and the power is skewed across the food system away from farmers who aren't getting a fair price for their product. And who have become, in many cases, commodity slaves and so on. The idea that we can fix that just by relying on the market is a fantasy. We need I mean, the economics of the food system are complex, but we need to be investing in the right sort of food production systems and in the right sort of practices that help resolve these challenges. And that's going to need government support. And this language, public money for public goods, which has been used in the context of the new ELM system and the agriculture bill, is the right language.
Could you explain for us, Rob, about what the new public goods system for England is?
Well, yeah, broadly speaking, it's you know, when you look at everything a farmer does, it's often more than just produce food. So it's caring for the land, for the soil, for the wildlife that's in the vicinity, for hedgerows and natural capital, and so on. And the idea is that farmers should receive payments from the government for delivering outcomes in line with these public goods. So for healthier soils and for higher animal welfare and so on. The things that we value as a society, which we know farmers can deliver, we should be paying them for. That's the premise, more or less, behind the bill. But there's a very convoluted process underway of developing this new farmer payment system, which I don't think is instilling anyone with much confidence that we're there yet.
Charlie?
And I think Nick made the point beautifully that the impact of not having the payments is that a huge number of farms would go out of business, and that would disproportionately impact areas of the rural economy that need farms to provide employment. So there's a wider question here, not just about why do we have these payments, but how do we locate farming payments within a broader rural development?
But hasn't New Zealand survived? Hasn't New Zealand managed to survive getting rid of this?
Yeah, so New Zealand has, but it's a much smaller economy with a less diverse farming sector, I think, although Nick can correct me if I'm wrong. But also the immediate short-term impacts were negative, with farms going out of business, that having huge implications for mental health of farmers and regrettably some suicides happening. And also it's not necessarily good for the environment. If you have a public money for public goods payment scheme, then you're incentivizing farmers to engage in particular types of behavior that should be good for farming over the long term and also better environmentally. If you get rid of payments altogether, then there's no incentive there for farmers to, for example, look at that longer term environmental set of goals. Rather, they might be going for short-term immediate economic returns for understandable reasons, which might mean they increase their use of pesticides and so on. And that's exactly what happened in New Zealand. So you saw some negative social and environmental impacts in the short term. Okay,
so would you argue that now that we're leaving the European Union, we are indeed going to change at least the basis upon which payments are made and moving towards this public goods approach? I mean, is that an improvement on the current system?
So I would say yes, it is, as long as it's calibrated appropriately so that we're making sure the money's going to the right places. Because one of the problems with the current system is that big farms can still take money that they don't need and small farms don't get that much. So it's about thinking creatively.
To those who use most land. Yeah, okay. All right, at last we've come to the end of our allotted time. Could I say a big thank you to Charlie and to Rob and to Nick for an interesting discussion. And obviously we were covering a wide terrain, but hopefully the discussion has given you some appreciation of some of the arguments that underlie some of the issues we're talking about. And also, clearly also one of the things also the discussion's brought out is that perhaps there are also some wider values here about how we produce food and how we farm, that some of the particular arguments that we've asked you to think about, like GMOs and glyphosate, etc., are examples of, and that might be something you want to think about when you go back into your group. So I think if I'm doing things correctly, but if I'm not, I will soon be told that what you've now got is going to ask you to go back into your breakout groups for about 15 minutes for a debrief on today, and we will then recommence again tomorrow morning at 9:30, and that you'll start off tomorrow morning with a chance to discuss what you've made of the presentations and discussion that you've heard during the last hour or so. But I will simply sign off and say thank you all very much for participating during the course of the day. As I said before, we hope you enjoy it. And of course, above all, we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow morning when we move on to another subject that, is arguably about as close to our hearts as, what we eat, which is what we can buy and the rules and regulations that surround that. But for the meantime, thanks very much indeed.